Okay. Really great conversation. And you know what we haven't had an opportunity to do is give a round of applause to our panelists. Thank you all so much. And really appreciate you all being here. I'm going to take the first question because I think it will help launch some of the other things, but somebody was wondering, where are the other school administrators from Wakefield and Yorktown? And I just wanted to make sure that you all knew we would love to have every single principal up here and joining us in this kind of a conversation, but I think that's more of a 3-day long event. And so what we really tried to do is make sure that we had somebody from elementary, middle, and high school here, and that we do have other folks from Wakefield. Aaron is here, and I don't know if the Yorktown person is here, but they are here in the impact of this conversation. They might not be in this room, but I will then turn it over to the first question, who I think Greg wants to answer.
And I'll piggyback on that real quickly. I did speak with the principal at Wakefield and Yorktown today, and we'll be talking to them tomorrow about what occurred here this evening. And I know that both of them had, as most principals do, another activity tonight. For example, Dr. Pacey at Yorktown had their annual awards ceremony tonight, so that's where he is. But I think I got a great question here. What happens when a student posts an inappropriate image on social media wearing a school uniform or outfit that identifies the school? And, you know, APS does have a policy on an inappropriate use of technology. But in this case, when something like this comes to me, maybe something was posted on Snapchat, which is one channel, those are not accessible at school. They can't pull those up. So what's happened usually is it was posted at night, and then kids are discovering it the next morning. And the person who would report something like this to me or an assistant principal would likely be the victim, because they're at school now and others have heard about this or have seen it. And as you can imagine, they were usually very upset. So in that case, I would first get the student involved with his or her counselor to make sure that they have a conversation with a counselor, and who would then try to ease some of that situation and embarrassment that they're feeling. Second thing I would do is contact the parent, because I think it's very important that the parent's aware that this is something inappropriate and it is posted. So I would contact the parent. One other thing that would bother me in a case like this is now the student has actually partially identified him or herself by wearing, if it's a Washington Lee General shirt, because now if it's out there, any nut in the country could now know that this child goes to Washington Lee High School. And so that raises some more concerns to me. So in this case, I wouldn't always notify the school resource officer with a situation like this, probably never. But since this child is now somewhat identified, at least by school, this is a case I probably would just make the SRO aware that this had occurred.
So now we're just going to sort of go from panel question to panel question, and we'll try to get to as many as possible. And I have asked that for those that we can't get to tonight, that if you all have an opportunity to maybe write down some responses, then on our website, in previous conversations that we've had like this, we have a little question and answer section on the website. So we'll try to get to as many as possible. So I don't know if our third panel wants to take a question now, if you want to look through.
Well, one of the questions that we have here is, why aren't we, i.e. students, learning and talking about this in school? And I think that's a great question. I think it goes back to what my colleague Matt Foley was saying. You know, we certainly would love to be a part of any regular presentation, and we have had over the years, as Matt has said, we've appeared at different family network forums and PTA meetings to talk about, you know, things like, is there still such a thing as a prank, and what happens when your kid goes through the system, and, you know, the effects on your permanent record and college applications. And we have had discrete things over the years at the various high schools that have been well attended by students, but it's usually in the evening, and it hasn't been part of the regular curriculum. But I know Matt and I stand ready to be involved in something that on a regular basis is rolled out at the beginning of a school year, where kids who can be present and they can hear about, you know, what the process looks like, you know, what Matt would tell you as defense counsel, what you could expect from my office if you're being prosecuted. So I think that would be fantastic.
And
One thing I want to say, back in the day, well, every year we celebrate Law Day. It's not just in Arlington County, but it's nationwide, which I've been a member of our local bar for Arlington County for about 23 years. And so we used to have a very active program in May where we'd reach out to the high schools and junior high, and members of the bar, both civil and criminal, would appear and speak before classrooms about their areas of practice. It could be anything from wills and estates to, of course, criminal defense law, or prosecutors could do it. And then it kind of faded away for a bit, and I think it needs to come back. That's a yearly event, but it's a very good thing for students to learn about. Some of these young students are going to eventually be attorneys themselves, or they're going to have involvement with the civil or the criminal justice system on a good side or not a good side. But in any event, it's important to do. Our kids need to be educated about their rights, because the emphasis often, again, in our society is your rights. If you assert them, that's a bad thing. I mean, you know, the rights that we have in our Constitution, your rights to counsel, your rights to remain silent, your rights against unreasonable searches and seizures. You know, we fought a war with a country that was overly intrusive at the time, and we developed our own country with certain rights. And these days, it's looked on in a derogatory fashion. If you assert your rights, say, I don't want to speak about that, then you're considered uncooperative. I don't want you to search my backpack, you're being uncooperative. It's like, no, I'm asserting my rights. These are my rights, to have privacy, to be left alone. That's our country. So it's good for our kids to be educated about it, but to do it in a way so that we can all get along together and not have unnecessary incidents between police officers and students or adults about these types of things. So I, again, encourage our school administrators to consider it. Thank you.
Okay, do we want to hear from Susan or Paul? Do you have a question that you want to grab the microphone?
Okay, I got a handful of cards here, so I probably won't get through them all. So if you have any questions at the end of this, I'll be happy. I'll be staying, and I can answer any individual questions. But one of the questions that I got, there was a couple of, is what are the requirements to be an SRO? Well, they apply for the position. You have to be a corporal, so you have to have been on for a couple of years and gotten promoted to the rank of corporal. Then they put in, we put out a process. They put in their their resumes and stuff. Then we do an interview, and from the interview we pick from the SROs whether they fit. And there's a number of questions in there. So there's not specific qualifications other than they have to be a corporal. That's the big one. Then they actually.
About the assistant principals participating in that.
Oh, okay.
Okay.
And in the interview process, we do have an assistant principal from the school sit on the panel to help making the decisions, and then we rank them. I did want to let you know that they do go to training that's specific for the SROs. It's by DCJS, the Department of Justice. They put it on. It's a week-long school. It encompasses a lot of different aspects of dealing with juveniles, diversity, CIT, and I can't think of what CIT stands for. There it goes. It's sensitivity training, so it teaches you how to deal with, because we've got kids in the school from all over the world and with all different types of disabilities. So it teaches us how to handle kids with from wherever walk of life they're coming from. So they get a lot of extensive training, and with the police department, it's just part of being a police officer, every 2 years you have to go through that training too. So they get extensive training in that aspect. That was my one question.
Okay, who wants to go next?
So, yes, the question that I have is, what records does APS maintain on student drug use and/or related offenses? So for APS, we have to follow state code. So as every school system in Virginia does, the state puts out a violation code book that really identifies all the different violations that can exist. It provides us the definition, and it also indicates whether or not it could lead to criminal charges or whether or not it is something that is not, basically, and whether something is a serious offense or whether something is not a serious offense. I'll go right into another question that was asked about what kinds of discipline issues come to my level. They typically have to do with things related to drugs, to weapon, and to threats. Those are viewed as serious offenses at the highest level, so those are the incidents that come to me. But in terms of what the school, the procedures that the school follows is basically to walk through gathering the information and the investigation. If the student is found to be guilty of the violation, then the school administrator makes a determination on what the consequences might be. We have a guidebook that really says if it's a first-time offense, then this may be a recommended consequence versus a second versus a third, but it's always important to keep in mind that it's a case-by-case basis. When we talk about drugs, I know many of you are very familiar with second chance, so for first-time offenders, we actually look to provide a preventive option for students instead of taking disciplinary action. And we have a database system that allows us to put that information into a certain drop-down menu so it actually isn't viewed as a violation. If the student completes the program, then really there is no disciplinary action as it relates to this particular violation. But second chance is specific to first-time offenders, and I think it's a great example of the partnership because the court system can use it, the school system can use it, and a parent can make a decision to also access second chance. So it's just one example of trying to provide an alternative for students in lieu of suspension.
Do you want to take another question?
Well, this question is, the criminal justice system seems to be very well organized, but is oriented toward accountability and punishment. As a community, what do we do to build strengths and help our kids thrive? I will say the first part of that question is absolutely true. I mean, the criminal justice system is about accountability and punishment, and that's how it should be. And I don't think that's a bad thing. And I think, tempering justice with mercy is how we proceed as prosecutors, and that's how I look at the criminal justice system, to be sure that we're acting fairly and for not only avenging for victims and speaking up for victims, but also to make sure that a defendant's rights are also protected. Because as prosecutors, we are ministers of justice. We have a completely different role than a private criminal defense attorney or a private civil attorney. And I think one of the luxuries of being a prosecutor is that our only marching orders are to do the right thing. And sometimes the right thing is not even to bring a prosecution or decline to prosecute, or exercising prosecutorial discretion in a way that an individual is not charged for various reasons. And we do that a lot, more than people probably would imagine. The second part of this question is, as a community, what do we do to help build strengths and help kids thrive? I think it gets back to community, to your block, to the people who, your next door neighbors. I think we've moved away from a time in our society where if, Johnny, your next door neighbor's kid was screwing around and you were to call him out on it, that's what you did back when I was growing up in South Chicago. Everyone kind of weighed in on parenting. Nowadays, and I think it's true, that if you were to approach another parent to criticize their child or to report about something, you're going to get pushback. And then you get, well, your kid did this, and that's not a good conversation to have. So as a parent and as a criminal justice professional, I think we need to support one another more when we're talking about our children. And for those of us who have escaped the criminal justice system, which means our children have not had to go through it, consider yourself lucky. It's not, it's not a better parent. It's not because you're smarter or you're more engaged. It's because in a lot of ways you're just luckier. And I think that that's something that we should be more supportive of our parents and being parents and looking less to the system and less to government to take care of our children.
That's actually something that Theo and I agree about. Someone give me that recording when we're done, please. So I agree with that wholeheartedly, and we have another question here, which I think is a very good one. It says, as a community, how do we help our weak and damaged families? The people here are the elite, and that's true. A lot of people in Arlington County are the elite. We're very educated, we're very wealthy. I guess you could say cream of the crop, right? That's a lot of it, but that's not everybody. There's a lot of folks who are here who don't come from wealth, who don't come from high education. Who come from both locally and come from other countries, and they're the poor, the outcast, the immigrant, and so forth and on. And I come from an immigrant family myself. I know Theo's probably heard the story more than a few times. So, my dad's dad came over from Ireland, and he came here illegally, and he was dirt poor. His family was dirt poor. 12 kids in a shack. In Limerick. You all heard about Limerick, Angela's Ashes. Rough times, and my dad grew up in the South Bronx, where it wasn't like Arlington County, where the police were corrupt beyond the pale. We have a very professional police force, very well-trained police force. We're very lucky to have that. But my dad grew up where it was different than that. And so how do we help families who are weak and damaged? I'll give you an example. We have Kelvin Manners here today, who's with Arm in Arm, which is a wonderful organization that we're beginning to partner with. And so one of the ways we help is we partner with folks like Kelvin, who reach out to people who suffer from trauma, who suffer from substance abuse, in some cases, mental health issues in the community, people who are suffering in the community, because if they are supported by other members of their community, then they will thrive, and we'll all raise the boats up together. And so partnering with organizations like this is an example of things that we can do. The Public Defender Office, we are state employees, but our job is to help the poor. People are not appointed to our office unless they're indigent. If you're indigent in Virginia, you're considered to make under 125% of the federal poverty guidelines. So if you're making under $14,000 and some change as a single individual, you're indigent. Well, guess what? You can make a lot more than that, still be indigent here in Arlington County. But these are the people we help. And we help a lot of people who come from countries where the police are corrupt and they don't trust them. And that affects how they interact with the police here, where to get anything from the police, you have to bribe them. I've been to countries where, you can do all sorts of things as long as you pay the bribes. And there are places in the U.S. that are like that still as well. So the way we do it is we partner together. We have to engage in outreach, and outreach is a hard thing because the folks that need to be here today are not here, who need to hear some of this stuff, and so we have to go out and do that. And I've talked to Kelvin a lot about that, and outreach, it requires a lot of effort and time and energy. So that's how we do it, and the schools are a gateway. We got a lot of folks in our schools who are not from here, who come from other countries, who come from other places. And so the ability of Theo's office to come in and my office to come in and others from our community to come in, of course the police are there, for example, and educate folks about how our system works. Because a lot of people don't even know what public defenders do. I mean, I used to think everyone knows what a public defender does, but I've learned that not everybody knows that, what our roles are. We do so much beyond the courtroom. And part of that is outreach to communities and educating folks in communities about what do you do when you interact with a police officer? How do you properly assert your rights? What are your rights? Why do we have those rights? Why are they important? And then we take that for granted, and it's taught in our schools to some degree, but it's nice to have people who are involved with the ins and outs of that system every day, and we see the ramifications of it. So that's one of the ways, and very good question.
Susan, do you have another question you want to address? Or Paul, either?
Okay, another question I got, is there a success metric that involves resolving disputes without involving escalation to involve the courts? We don't have a metric. But a lot of the things that we do in school, a lot of it does not go to the courts. We do community service in the schools. There's peer mediation that we use in the schools. We use mediation with counselors. So there's a lot that's involved, but we don't measure how successful that is. The only time we encounter is if the kid comes back again for the same offense, then we got to come up with a different solution as to how we're going to address it. But generally, first time offense, unless it's serious and we have no choice, it doesn't go to the courts. And we're talking about a very small percentage of the instances that are criminal that actually go to court. There's a whole process that we do when there's a criminal incident. If we want to go to court, we have to go to the intake office, tell them what we have, and they say, yep, it fits the thing, we'll write it up. Then we go to the Commonwealth Attorney's office. We give them what we have, and they say whether or not they think it's prosecutable or they think it should go some other way. And then, once everybody agrees, then a charge is placed on a juvenile. But there's a whole process to go through, so there's a lot that's done outside of the court system.
Any of our principals, administrators?
So my question is, what is the boundary between APS administrators and SROs? What behaviors or incidents do each handle, and what data are collected? So I'll start with the boundary. I think as has been shared here, we do a lot of work together. And when it becomes a situation in which a child has broken a rule or a law, that's where I think our lanes become differentiated. So, and we share this with kids at our safety assemblies at the beginning of the year, and when we're talking with kids, I often say, there's a school consequence, and then there may be a police consequence that Corporal Treacle will work with you on, you and your parents. So in the school consequence, and it really does depend on what the offense is, but if we've got some issues, Greg made some reference reference to using our counselors, for example. If substance abuse is an issue, there are procedures that we follow, but we also engage our substance abuse prevention counselors as well, and that is in a preventative manner. And so we really follow the APS code of conduct for students, and then the police officer relates to the criminal context, if you will, and as Susan pointed out, there are procedures in that regard. The behaviors and incidents that each handle, I think I've addressed that, and then what data are collected. Cynthia made some reference to the fact that we are obligated to note school code when it has been violated, and so that data would be the information that we would keep at the school base.
I just want to point out that we have about 10 minutes before 8 o'clock, so I don't know who wants to take the next question, but I'm just giving you a little bit of warning on time. It's my job.
I'm going to kind of like share this with our SROs because Kim had dropped it off with us, but the question is, what data do you have that illustrate how hard SROs try to not charge students? And then the sub-question is this data reported by ethnicity and race? I think that's more an SRO question. I mean, I think I mentioned in my earlier remarks that it's obvious to me that when officers come to our office to get a criminal charge against a juvenile, it's rarely, if ever, the first time that they've dealt with that youngster. It's mostly, they almost always have had many interactions with the student and are finally having to bring a criminal charge. I think that that is an accurate reflection of how things are operating in the schools, but I'm going to ask Susan to weigh in on that as well. I mean, as far as data, I don't have, we don't cross-examine the officers about, I have a box, a check list of, how many times have you had an encounter with this child before, that kind of thing. We don't do that because it's more of a conversation to get information and to determine if a charge is appropriate, if we're going to go forward with the prosecution, if my office will sign off on the prosecution. So it's more of that kind of interaction. But I'm going to ask Susan to maybe weigh in on that because I think that's something that you could talk about just as well.
Yeah, we don't really keep the data, like I said, on the interactions where we mediate stuff. If it rises to the criminal, we do take a report, and if we do mediation in the report, it's resolved as there was peer mediation, which was successful. The parents were contacted and are satisfied with the results. So as far as that, there is a police report on hand. So if the kid were to ever reoffend again, we could look into our system to see if he's ever been involved in let's say it's a fight. So we would know we'd had multiple contacts, but the SRO is going to know that anyway, unless they've changed schools for some reason. But as far as keeping stats, we don't really keep any kind of stats for that. So unfortunately, we don't collect our successes very well. It's harder to measure those. And that kind of led into another question that we did have here. Most of the stuff that we deal with in the criminal nature in the schools is brought to the SROs. It's not something that SROs ferreted out, okay? This is stuff that is told to teachers or counselors or kids come to us. It's not generally stuff that the SROs proactively are searching for in the schools. So we're walking around the schools, we're trying to make sure the kids get to class and stuff, but the criminal nature's stuff is brought to us generally by others. So there was a question that said there's a rumor that in the community that students of color are disproportionately affected or targeted by police. Further, there is a trend of this, or thread of this story, that students are targeted based on their ethnicity and perceived documentation status. We don't look at that at all. I mean, documentation status, we don't know. We don't ask kids that. Even if we come in contact with in a police incident, that question's never asked. We don't ask that question. They're here, living here in Arlington, they have the same rights as everybody else to be protected and be safe in their school. So we don't look for we don't target people per se. Like I said, most of the stuff that we deal with is brought to us from others. So there is no targeting. So I can't speak to the disproportionality if there is one. I'd actually have to look at stats, but we don't target anybody.
The question I'm going to address is, can an SRO take a child out of school without notifying the parents, and what's the role of the school? So I'll handle the part of the SRO there. There are instances where we can take the child out of school without notifying the parents, and a prime example that I can give you on that is anything where a child is CPS involved, which is Child Protective Services, where they are the victim and the potential suspect is one or both of the parents. So if Child Protective Services is doing an investigation to protect the child from their own parents or legal guardian, and that is the target of the investigation, and that is pretty much self-explanatory why we wouldn't be notifying those people, the parents and or the guardians, why CPS and our Special Victims Unit investigators need to speak with the child. So in that instance, obviously the school knows, and the child is taken to CPS, where our SVU investigators meet with them and they continue with their investigations. Other instances are if there is some type of court involvement where court needs them brought to court, or there's a detention order. So those are just some of the examples. With regards to what's the role of the school, unless I've got this wrong, and Scott can correct me if I'm wrong, we tell the school, they're aware of it. If it's a CPS situation, they can't notify the parent either. They're acting as legal guardians because the child is in the school at the time. If it's a detention order situation, again, we notify the school, and then the school will notify the parent, but our responsibility on that is to get the individual to court where they're needed immediately. Did I catch that wrong, Scott?
Yeah. And I think, but if you're talking about sort of the kind of scenarios we discussed a little earlier, in those cases, we're going to be reaching out to the parent right away. That's going to be step one, talk to child, find out what's going on. Step two is going to be to call the parent and let them know that we're talking to your child. The SRO is going to be involved, and to encourage the parent to come in to be a part of that discussion too.
Go ahead.
Oh, okay, well, I had a question to answer. This is a pretty short and sweet one. What is on a child's school record when he is detained or charged with a crime? And I think this kind of gets back a little bit to what Bridget was talking about a little earlier. That's two very distinct lanes. If a child has broken a school rule, we'll have a record of that at the school, that a child, violated X rule, had a detention, had an in-school suspension, an out-of-school suspension, what have you. If that involves a criminal matter, obviously we're going to be sharing that information with our SROs. They're going to do their thing in terms of going to court if need be and charging and so forth. But that's two distinct sets of records, and they don't really cross paths.
I still got questions.
We got time for one more.
Okay. Well, this one wasn't an easy one. It says, what does the police department do to keep great SROs, and why is it helpful, or why is it hurtful to officers' careers to be an SRO? What's not hurtful to their career to be an SRO? The SROs are corporals, so that's a level that you're at. There's one sergeant, and he's back there with us, and a lieutenant that's in charge of the SROs. But if you want to work with kids closely as an SRO, a corporal is all you're going to be. So, and in that respect, it does limit your salary cap. So if you want to be promoted, you have to move on. And just because, like I was an SRO, when I made sergeant, I didn't stay in the SRO program. You move around and diversify your career just like you would anywhere else. And what can we do to keep great SROs? It just comes down to money. At some point, you have to move on because you're starting to think about retirement and what am I going to do for retirement? I need to get promoted. I need to make more money. So that kind of limits it. We can't keep people down. So we gotta let them go.
What I was going to say is maybe now we could do a final, Cynthia, if you've got 30 seconds of, Theo, If you all have 30 seconds of something that hasn't been covered, that's a burning issue that we want to make sure, now's the time.
I don't have any burning issues. I just want to reiterate the fact that it is a partnership and that together we always make the best decisions, I think, in the best interest of students, and that's the journey we want to continue to take. And I think there's been some ideas that have been suggested here about, furthering the education and awareness opportunities for students, so that is something that we can give further thought to as well.
Matt or Theo?
There's too many burning issues, so.
Susan?
I too don't really have any other burning issues, but I will be around if anybody has any questions at the end. I'll be happy to answer anything that you have.